pushing us live, and I'm popping off.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Bye.
All right. All right. Well, here we are. I am excited. Hello, everybody. I am Rich Diviney. I'm the author of The Attributes, 25 Hidden Drivers of Optimal Performance, and founder of The Attributes Incorporated. I'm very excited today because I'm welcoming Professor Eric Johnson. Professor Johnson is a Norman Eig Professor of Business and the Director of the Center for Decision Sciences at the Columbia Business School. A leader in decision-making research, he wrote a book called The Elements of Choice, about how choices are designed and why it's so important to understand their inner working. So welcome, Eric. It's a real pleasure to have you.
Thanks. Great to be here, Rich. I'm happy to have a chance to talk to your audience.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I, just to kind of start, I'd like, just for the listeners who don't know the concept of choice architecture, could you kind of explain shortly what that exactly means and the whole concept behind it, please?
So I think it's really good to start with a concrete example. So, for example, imagine you're given a menu in a restaurant. Yes, the chef's decided, what are the good dishes, but there've been a bunch of decisions that have been made by someone I'll call a designer. We can call this the choice architecture. And what have they done? They've decided how many dishes to put on the menu, how to arrange them, how to describe them, even how to put the prices down. So one of the really interesting questions is, someone has been there before you. They're sort of your hidden partner, and they'll influence your choice in ways that you probably don't realize.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And so, so in terms of our everyday decision making, because where we walk around and I think we find ourselves. Well, actually, I imagine we don't find ourselves. We're not conscious of a lot of the decisions we're making at any given moment. So how does this type of architecture work on the kind of the unconscious decision making piece versus the conscious decision making piece, or is it all kind of mixed in?
Well, I'd like to think about it as whether you're aware of these influences, whether you know what they're going to influence you. So what research shows is people tend not to realize that these influences affect their choices. Yeah. So a very quick example, one of the biggest effects in the whole literature is defaulting people into an option. A box is pre-checked on a web form. Yeah. You ask people, did that have an influence? They say no. But we have shown, and lots of research shows, those can be huge effects. In areas like organ donation, we see there's 40% more people who could be a donor when that box is pre-checked than when it's not. So it's a very powerful tool.
Oh, interesting. So in other words, where we have where the system would say, the question would be, are you willing to be an organ donor? And I check yes, versus the default is that you're already an organ donor, and the question is, do you not want to donate organs? Okay,
that's right. That's a classic, what we call default effect.
Fascinating. And so you and I had a quick conversation before we went live here, and I was telling you in some of the SEAL training that I ran, and it was really assessment and selection. We worked, we used a lot of Daniel Kahneman's work, Thinking Fast and Slow, in terms of how we made decisions on candidates. But obviously, we were always really very focused on decision making, but specifically decision making under duress, under stress and challenge, when stress starts, or even fear, right? What can you tell us about that type of decision making? And I know you and I talked a little bit about Sully, which is a great story as well, but I'd love to kind of dive into that aspect of decision making.
Sure. One of the things that a good choice architecture, a good designer does, is let you concentrate on the information that's really important and lets you ignore the others. Okay. So I did a deep dive into cockpit design, which was very interesting. And there's a quote which I love, which is, the key to being a good cockpit design is it shows you the information the pilot needs when they need it in an ambiguous and easy to understand fashion. Anything else is just clutter.
Yeah.
And compare that idea to going to Amazon, where you see 4,000 kinds of work gloves, and not to mention ads for laundry detergent and other things. Yeah. So in the Sully case, there was a gauge. It's called the tape speed gauge, which actually allows him to do something that was very important. Just to give you a little background, as you recall, he took off. I'm in New York, so not far from here, LaGuardia. Yeah. Hit some geese and had 288 seconds to land the plane, full of 100 passengers. One thing that he did was he quickly, early on, turned on a generator that actually let this gauge work. This was called a glass cockpit. So everything was an electronic gauge.
Right.
If he hadn't turned that on, he would have been literally flying blind.
Right.
No gauges at all.
Yeah.
What this gauge does is say, here's the angle in which you're flying, and here's the speed, and it combines those two to let you fly as far as possible.
Mm-hmm.
So, Sully, that gave Sully more time to make decisions. And the quote I love from reading the NTSB reports is, I quickly load shed. And he borrowed that from electricity providers who basically shut down the factories and keep the hospitals running.
Yeah.
What that let him do is concentrate on what was important for him, which is essentially saving lives. And he said, look, I have three options. I can try and go back over some of the most crowded airspace in the world, back to LaGuardia. I can fly over to Teterboro, which is a small airport on the other side of the river. And he thought about this because it was out the window and he wasn't looking at other things.
Right.
There was this big river in front of him. He'd been to New York and he says, if I landed down in the 40s somewhere, there's a lot of fireboats there. There are a lot of ferries. There are police patrols. That would be the place people get off the plane safely.
Yeah.
And so that allowed him to concentrate on one question. That gauge actually doesn't get the key to the city, but it should have. It freed him up to actually think about what was important.
Yeah, because it was right in front of him. And it was basically it was acting as the designer in that case of some of the information that was allowing or giving him to process that.
The way I think about it is the cockpit designer was the designer. He was the chooser, and it helped him perform better.
Yeah. And so what if we were to back up that whole scene, right?
Mm-hmm.
In terms of his decision to turn on the generator in the first
Right.
place, in the first place, what can we say about that architecture or about that decision?
Yeah, it's really interesting and sort of surprising because his co-pilot was there with a checklist, what to do when an engine fails, or in this case, two engines of the two on the plane fail. And it was on page 2 because they assumed that what happened at 20,000 feet or above.
Right.
They were not that, but somehow Sully had the wisdom to know what information he needed, and he reached up. And someday I'll call him up and ask why he did that.
Yeah.
But clearly that was key to actually know that I needed that tool. I needed to concentrate on that and not other things.
Yeah, and so I'm trying to kind of transpose this into, well, first, I guess my old world in terms of the SEAL environment and combat, when you have a bunch of uncertainty around you, and so it's almost difficult to determine a designer in that case, or determine what the designer could be, and so you're bombarded with information. Is there a way that people can take more active control of their decision making when it feels like there's too much information being thrown at them at any one time, in kind of state of deep uncertainty or panic or anything like that?
Well, I think the question is good. And you're talking about an unstructured environment. I tend to think about structured environments, web pages, cockpits, but still the principle is the same, which is there's information that is important and information that's less important. Yeah. What's interesting about the domain you talk about is uncertainty about what information is important.
Right.
You don't know what you have to pay attention to. At the same time, what training does, and you know this better than I, is allow you to pick out the important information from the unimportant information.
Yeah.
So I'm looking for this, and this, because that's sign of a bad guy.
Yeah. Yeah.
As opposed to looking at all around.
So could we call that in some ways that's the training has given us some constructs of design inside of which we can formulate some decisions.
Right. Every decision we make is as much about ignoring information as it is about paying attention to information.
Yeah.
And what the designer can do if they're doing it right is help you pay attention to the information that's most important.
Yeah, yeah. So in my work, I talk about attributes. One of the attributes I talk about is compartmentalization. And compartmentalization, I really was interested in exploring it because of this idea, this ability to take in a bunch of information, but immediately assess, prioritize, and then focus on what you need to focus on. Which in it sounds like is part of at least the neurological decision making process. Are some people better at this than others in terms of what you've seen, how humans make decisions?
I mean, there's certainly people who are experts at decisions, look at different information. Mm-hmm. Sometimes that means they do better in other cases, they basically are fooling themselves, so they can be overconfident. I did do a lot of research on menus in restaurants and looked at what consultants say, and it turns out what consultants said was basically wrong. It seemed to make sense to them. They would say they know how to look at a menu and tell you whether it's going to work. When people actually test that, that doesn't work. It turns out there's a technology that's really useful, which is eye tracking. I can actually look at what someone is looking at. And when people actually started eye tracking restaurant menus, they found out the experts were basically all wrong in terms of what people looked at.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So kind of another, I guess, facet of this whole thing is indecision. When we're, in terms of decision architecture and everything, all of your research, where does indecision fall into all of this?
So indecision is a great way of avoiding making a choice. It's by definition, but it's encouraged by bad choice architecture.
Okay. Tell me more.
So let me give you my favorite example, which is here in New York City, kids get a choice, which sounds great, of which high school to go to. In fact, they get to rank order 12 high schools, and those high schools rank the students, and somehow magically they end up right. And it has a good process because kids will pick schools that are better and reject schools that are worse on things like graduation rates. And that forces schools to improve potentially. The problem is in New York City in 2018, they gave them a book the size of an old school telephone directory that had 769 different schools. And poor kids, 8th graders, even their parents, and not all of them are, native English speakers, struggle with that much choice. So they end up looking at attributes that might not be that diagnostic. One which might make some sense is graduation rate. It turns out in New York City, there are schools that graduate as few as 40% of the students, which is just, it's not only a shame, it's a tragedy. So what we should do is actually look at that. The problem is if you look at just the very best schools, you're looking at schools that have 95% graduation rates. The students there are students who'll go to Harvard. You're going to end up with this, the poor 8th grader I talked about in the book, applied to all very good schools. He was valedictorian of his grammar school, but didn't get into any of them because some of them are harder to get into than Harvard. So he should have looked at a trade-off, look at more than just graduation rates. And because there were so many, he was overwhelmed. He looked at just one attribute, not your kind of attribute, one characteristic of the schools.
That's amazing. So we'll tend to, because our brains are inherently trying to find ways to save energy and save time, we'll cull the choices down to the couple that might be just in front of our face or might be easiest to kind of process.
And based on the ease of processing, that's really important. It's not necessarily the most important attribute. It's the ones that are easy to look at. So example, I love to talk about, even though I'm not a user, are dating sites. You can have dating sites like, for example, Tinder, where you have an infinite number of options. I just want you folks to think about that, and you probably can figure out what options people look at and what attributes. They look at the pictures. Compare that to another site, which was started by 3 women who wanted to make a site for women called Coffee Meets Bagel that originally used just one option a day. With one option a day, what are you going to do? Well, you look at the picture and then you say, what else is going on with this person? And so you end up processing those two situations very differently.
And it seems more manageable because it is.
And you're going to make a different decision. You're not going to screen. You're not going to say, oh, looks good, looks good, looks good. And we know those pictures may or may not be faithful reproductions.
So I want to get into kind of how leaders could use this. But before I do, just when we talk about just us as average citizens every day, what are some things we can do in our day-to-day lives to help us make better decisions, be more confident in decisions, and be more aware of decision architecture?
So I think you've nailed one thing, which is to be aware. When you ask people if choice architecture has had an influence on them, they tend to say no. So classic studies change the default, and then they ask people, were you affected by that pre-checked box? And most people will say no, even though the study shows that they do. They pick to be a donor more often than not, but everyone will say, that didn't influence my choice. So we are actually being influenced and we're not aware of it. And the reason is it's sort of hard to do 2 things at once. You want to make a choice, You want to book a flight, you want to find a date, you want to rent an apartment. And it's very hard at the same time to say, why did they arrange things this way?
Right.
Why did they actually only present 4 options? Or why did they sort them this way? These are all things that will influence choice, but we're not going to be aware of it.
Yeah. Yeah. Might it be a good, I guess, tactic, I guess to use a military term, to enter into a decision with some preconceived criteria that you want to look for and focus on?
Yeah, I mean, if you know enough, you should actually
Right.
say, here's what's important to me. So when you're looking at schools, you might say, gee, what's really important to me? Is it commute time? Is it, do I want a college prep school? But more often we end up approaching these choices, making up our minds about what we want based on what we see,
Based on
not
what we see.
something hypothetical.
Yeah, yeah, man, and oh, gosh, all I can think, and that I guess it's a whole different tangent, is what is all of the discussion about social media nowadays, and how these sites and social media tends to focus you in on the things that they want you to see, the things that will make you keep clicking, I guess.
Yeah, and there they have a very clear incentive, which is to keep you clicking.
Right.
There is a very cute example of Twitter has recently done, which is if I'm going to forward an article and I've not read the article, they will prompt me saying, "Do you want to read the article first?"
Oh, interesting.
That's a piece of choice architecture. A funny story. Someone was forwarding a tweet of mine that was about an article I'd written, and he got that prompt, which was funny because he was one of my co-authors on the article. He not only had read the article, he'd written it, but Twitter didn't know that.
Right. Okay. Well, that's good. I talk about leadership, and leadership is part of the concepts that certainly I deal with and certainly dealt with in the military. When we talk about leaders, whether they be military or business, but let's kind of focus on business leaders. How can they perhaps use choice architecture to help their team and their business? What are some ways they can do that?
The key is to realize that they are designers. They're actually becoming choice architects whenever they're presenting a choice to other people. A trivial example is not a business example. It's a friend of mine who, after talking to me, said, "I understand. I have a 3-year-old. And I used to say, do you want to go to bed or not?" And there'd be a big fight. They then changed it to, do you want to bounce into bed or do you want to fly into bed? Bedtimes was much more peaceful.
Yes.
And that's a place in ordinary life. Now, think about it as a business leader. You're presenting up to your boss options. You're presenting down to your reports options. You are actually a choice architect. So by varying the number of options you're presenting, the order in which you present them, all the tools of the designer has, I talk about, you can actually influence both your supervisors and your reports.
Yeah. Really understand you're in more control. Terrific. Right. We have a couple questions. I want to read a couple questions from the audience. So one is, so taking decisions usually require us to scope the problem and create a boundary of the available solution space. How can we effectively scope problems that so that decision making becomes easier?
That's exactly right. But there's a challenge here, which is scoping them in a way that doesn't constrain you. So one of the things that, like in the school example, it really needs less than 769 options.
Yeah.
Okay. But the question is, how do you get down to the smaller subset? One thing you don't want to do is rob people of choices that are different from each other.
Oh, okay.
Right. So there's a trade-off. And something I'd love to say is always present 5 options, but that'd be like me saying a plane should always have 2 engines. It depends on the kind of plane. The number of options is going to depend on the kind of the decision. The trade-off you need to make is between keeping the choice simple in terms of number of alternatives and giving people enough variety. So go to the high school, you want to make sure if you know enough about somebody, you can customize the set. But if you don't, you want to make sure they have a vocational high school, academic high school, and things like that. So customizing the set is a good way of scoping the set.
And then making sure you're not limiting yourself in that customization. So
that's correct.
So you might not be you in effect taking choices or taking options away from yourself by scoping them out.
Because ultimately there's a good option for you. You want to make sure that's in the set, not outside the set.
Yeah. Okay. Terrific. Another question, really interesting. Does how we grew up help us in terms of our decision-making ability, what architecture we use? If an environment lacks healthy nurturing versus positive, versus positive nurturing, does that affect our decision-making process as we get older?
What's interesting is, and it's been long an issue in the field, is we know a lot about how people should make decisions, but I don't think you, or I don't think I got a course in high school or grammar school about decision making. So I think the way I would answer that question is it could make a big difference, but what we don't do is do good decision education.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So would a good piece, at least for parents, right, is give your kids some choices and help them understand how and why they're making those choices.
That's right. In fact, I was lucky enough to write something that got reprinted in Education Week about how I helped my niece make choices about what courses to take in high school.
Oh, just give us a quick example of how you did that, because I'm sure the audience would love to.
She's an incredibly talented young kid who plays softball, is taking Mandarin. She could do lots of things. Yeah. So the question was this trade-off we were talking about. How do you trade off making sure she has exposure to new courses and new experiences, and at the same time don't overwhelm them? So basically what her parents did is sit down saying, well, you've never taken a course of this kind. Maybe you should take a humanities course, just so she has some exposure. So understanding the trade-off between variety and overwhelming, sort of getting that right.
Right. Yeah, that's so important. I'm going to use that. I have 2 teenage boys, and I'll use that. And one's getting ready to start looking at schools. Another great question I'm really curious about. What are your thoughts on rationality and emotion versus emotion in the decision-making process?
I think it's great. Let me first sort of say I have this little pet peeve against the word rationality.
Okay.
Because rationality sort of assumes you're going to be able to make the best possible perfect decision if you had all the time in the world and all the information in the world. And that would be nice, but that's not the world I live in. Mm-hmm. So it's basically doing better than other people, or doing better than you used to do. Right. So there are things we want to be. We want to be consistent, for example. So there are some principles you want to try and do, but this idea that being perfectly rational seems like a bit of a straw person.
Sure.
And emotion has 2 roles it's important to think about. It influences our decision making, and it also has a consequence of our decisions. So when I think about my MBA students who come talk to me about jobs, they say, should I be emotional or unemotional in my process? Right. I say, do you think you're going to be unemotional when you go to work every day? And they say, no. So then what is the emotion you feel now telling you about how you feel the first day on the job, the 10th day on the job? So emotion, can cloud our decision-making, but it also can be something that tells us about how we feel about what the experience will be like. The key is basically predicting what the emotion will be like.
Wow, that's so interesting, and I think poignant for us to remember, because it's always recommended, I guess, that we make decisions from a logical place, as logical as we can. But really, what you're saying is, hey, we're not always logical, right? We have emotion, inside of our everyday life. So try to predict that. When use a little of that in your prediction as you're making these decisions. That's fascinating.
And there are people who would argue it. You make better decisions when you allow emotion to it. I'm not saying that, but certainly there's an argument for that.
Yeah. Well, and I think a little bit of everything, right? It's going to be fine, right? So,
but it's important, by the way, to realize when those emotions are temporary.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Going a little bit further on the emotional scale, and we talk about anxiety, and we talked a little bit about this. I mean, we talked about certainly under pressure, but what's the link between decision making and anxiety?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, one of the things that seems to be the case is when you have a bad choice architecture, you get more anxious. So think about the poor kid with 769 schools. Wow. The quote that I love from some of the press coverage was his mother said, "I felt like a little mouse in a maze." Right. That's not going to lead to a good decision.
Yeah. Yeah.
So good choice architectures reduce anxiety. Something I think about a lot is fluidity. You want a decision where it feels like it's flowing as you make it, not that you're constricted.
And so would the corollary of that also be it's probably best to reduce anxiety as much as possible before making a decision, because then you're approaching with the proper architecture. So if you feel anxious, try to do your best to reduce that anxiety, and you'll in effect probably make a better decision.
Yeah, and if the situations make you anxious, figure out a way to reduce that anxiety.
Yeah. All right, terrific. This has been great. I have one more question, and we'll start. We'll land this plane, not in the Sully way, but in a normal way.
I see a tugboat on its way. We're okay.
Right. Good. I often talk about an idea behind asking better questions, and if we ask better questions of ourselves, we get better answers, and that affects the quality of our lives. I know you talk about questions and how to ask them. Can you give us some ideas, some advice on types of questions to ask ourselves that helps with this whole process and helps with decisions?
So one of the way that choice architecture works is by actually changing the questions we ask ourselves, what we call queries.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you think about this, if I'm asking a question, I'm actually the first question I ask will get more weight. So just to make it concrete, since you mentioned Kahneman, one of the great demonstrations, if I have a mug like this, I'm actually going to give you different prices if I own the mug and if I don't own the mug. And one of the reasons is that if I own the mug, the first question I ask myself is, what's good about the mug?
Right.
If I'm buying the mug, I say, what else can I do with the money?
Yep.
And what research shows is it's that difference in questions that ends up giving essentially much more value to the mug when you own it than when you don't own it.
Yeah.
So think carefully about the questions you ask of yourself and the order in which you ask them. And that's going to determine a lot of your preferences.
Are there some tips you can give people to make sure that they are doing that?
Something we do a lot is important is ask yourself the questions in two different occasions in different ways.
Okay.
So let me give you an example. Darwin ended up marrying his first cousin, little known fact. Okay. And in his journals, the first time he says, he does a list. What are the reasons not to get married? What are the reasons to get married? 3 or 4 months later, he writes the list, but now he says, what are the reasons to get married? What are the reasons not to get married? Turns out he proposed, I think, the next week.
Interesting. And just by flipping that order, he was able to...
By flipping the order can be very powerful.
Wow, yeah. You give the mug example, it just reminds me, my wife, she does real estate. She's a real estate agent, and she always remarks how when people own their house, they feel like it has a value other than people coming to buy the house. And what you talked about explains exactly why that is. We see what's our question, the direction from which we ask the questions is completely different. Yeah.
Right. And for her, if she wants to be an interesting choice architect, she should ask the owners, what's the downside of your house? What's the bad things? Because that's not a query they ask naturally.
Yeah. Well, Eric, this has been fantastic. I really appreciate the conversation. For everybody listening, I highly recommend Eric's book, The Elements of Choice. It's a great read, and it really dives deeply into this idea of decision making. You learn so much about why and how you make the decisions you do, and I think just like you said, Erica, that self-awareness is part of the solution. And so I very much appreciate your time. It's been wonderful talking to you. I joked with you, you and I could probably talk for hours, and I look forward to our next conversation. But thank you so much for being here with us today.
Great, Rich. Thank you so much. It's been fun.